Okay, so let's talk about boundaries versus limits. So let's start with some basic definitions. So at the root, boundaries really, it's that concept of a line that marks the limit of an area. That's a boundary. And they provide clarity and detail about our limits. Boundaries at their root are really what's okay and what's not okay. A lot of times when we look at boundary work, we get very binary, yes, no, what's okay, what's not okay. We're going to dive into that a little bit more on the next slide. But for now, just hold that. Limits are a little bit different. Limits have to do with that point beyond something that it just can't pass. Limits inherently, they're not good or bad. They're not right or wrong. They just are. Okay, and that's a really key thing to understand with limits versus boundaries. So limits have just this, they just are in the world, right? And the more we understand our limits, the better we can set our boundaries around them. So they also help us protect our boundaries. So when I'm connected in with my limits, which we'll get into, I'll get a much better, clearer sense of how to honor my needs around that. Boundaries, my personal favorite definition for boundaries is what is my authentic yes and my authentic no? And why do I add the word authentic in there? For me and the work that I've done over the years with boundaries, I have found that there is this, instead of just a binary world of yes and no, which sometimes we need that in boundaries. Sometimes we really do. We need a very clear yes and a very clear no. But there's also that subtle nuance work with boundaries where I don't really know my yes and no, and how do I work in that world, right? And there's kind of in that process, what I found over the years is there's this validation process that happens with boundaries. First, I need to validate it internally within myself, and then I need to bring voice to that. So it's that validation and vocalization part of boundaries where I think a lot of us can get tripped up. Myself, that's really what I found over the years. Now, I would like to put one disclaimer in here. If we're talking about a situation of abuse, a toxic work environment where we need professional help, I need a mentor or I need someone to support me, or maybe I need to reach out to HR, that is a very clear binary yes-no situation. That's not the nuanced work that I'm talking here, all right? And I just like to put that out there because if we're in that kind of situation, we need to get help immediately and we don't need to go through some internal validation process. We need to go get professional help in those kinds of situations, all right? Okay, but the reason why I say authentic yes and no is many of us early on have really learned to ignore that innate yes and innate no for ourselves, whatever that might have, whatever reason that might be, right? The mind can also have this tendency to kind of justify and override reality. My example that I like to use for this is, it can be Friday, late night in the evening, and I'm telling my family, hey, I got this. I'm totally good. I got this. I've got all this work. Meanwhile, I'm on like my third cup of coffee and my family's like, hey, we've had 3 weekends in a row where we've missed family game night, right? So I can justify all sorts of stuff in my own world, right? So for me, this concept of recognizing what's my authentic yes and no, it forces me to kind of pause and just remind myself to go a little bit deeper with my inquiry. So that really works for me. If authentic has any kind of negative connotation, just ignore it, right? Adapt this for whatever works for you. It's really about what works for you. All right. So let's talk about limits. So limits are, as we were talking about before, the key thing to remember with limits is it's really about that point which we can't go beyond. And so limits inherently, there's no good, bad, right, or wrong with a limit. There's tons of limits out there. I have the tendency to narrow them down to 3 pieces. I think all limits can kind of fall into these 3 categories. But the first one is a physical limit. Second one is an emotional limit. And the third is a mental limit. I'll give some examples of these. So years ago, I worked with a program director, and I come from the world of tech. So he was, doing a lot of technology work, always working on computers, right? And led a really large team. And he had carpal tunnel. He had some carpal tunnel issues. And he was heads down, and like many of us, working a lot of crazy hours. And eventually hit that point where he had to stop and he had to go and get surgery. He hit his limit, not right or wrong, just was. He had his limit. And then out of that, he had surgery, and then he was out for a couple of weeks, and he came back to the office. And as a result of that, he started doing more stretching exercises and taking breaks for himself. And he set his boundary out of that limit. So that's an example of a physical limitation, right? So an emotional limit, so a good example of this is, we can kind of go, you can see in the process of limits, we can kind of come up to a limit. It kind of has this this range in there that we can kind of play with. But once we hit that limit, there's no further we can go. Emotionally, what this looks like is I can move from a little bit of irritation or a little bit of frustration at my day all the way straight over to anger and rage, right? That's kind of my limit. So what this shows up for me, like, let's say I've had a really rough Monday. It's been a tough day. It's been a long day. I'm exhausted. I worked late. And then Tuesday rolls around, same process, right? I'm feeling really exhausted. Maybe a client's really upset. Maybe a project deadline is slipping and I'm feeling that pressure and tension. And I get home and it's 6:30 at night and I drive up to the driveway and I'm exhausted. I'm hungry. I walk through the door. Man, the dog is barking. Food hasn't been started. My husband also had a long day at work. My kids are crying and I lose it, right? Mama loses it and I have my moment. I hit my emotional limit. That's an example of that, right? And then out of that also, let's look at mental limits. Anybody ever been to, if you can type this in the chat bar, anybody ever been to a workshop or a really, really long seminar, maybe over multiple days? And at the end of that, you literally cannot take anything else in. Like, I don't want to watch a drama on TV. I don't want to do anything, but maybe a little bit of light comedy. Anybody ever reached their mental limit? Yeah, like every academic conference. Nice. Yeah. Okay, everybody get that, especially online. Isn't that the truth though? Yeah, it's so true. You bet. Absolutely, right? So those are some examples of limits.